Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Missing Frames Celebrating Superman series. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. Now, normally on Missing Frames, we watch all of the movies we should have seen by this point in our lives. But in the months leading up to the release of James Gunn's Superman on July 11th, I will be chatting with all of my favorite Superman writers, artists, filmmakers, fans, and more about all things Man of Steel. Most recently, I celebrated Richard Donner's Superman with the legendary film producer Lauren Shuler Donner. You can find that episode and all the other Celebrating Superman episodes right here on this podcast. You came to the right spot. There's so many amazing interviews to listen to with everyone from Mark Waid to Jason Aaron, and there's much more to come. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment, share. What else? What else can you do? Just do all the things, all of the things. So in today's episode, I'm joined by acclaimed writer and artist and all-around fantastic human being, Gene Luen Yang. Gene is the creator of the much-beloved graphic novel American-Born Chinese, which was also adapted into a Disney Plus series you might be familiar with. He also did Dragon Hoops, and by the way, both of these were Eisner-Award winners. No big deal. He also happened to write one of my all-time favorite Superman stories, which is Superman Smashes the Klan, illustrated by Japanese artist Gurihiru. I got to talk with Gene about his love of drawing, telling stories, how he grew up writing comics, and how once he was out of school, he worked full-time as a teacher and self-published on the side. And eventually, he moved into the realm of professional comic book publishing. We talk a little bit about how he made that transition. We also discuss the origins of Superman Smashes the Klan, how Gene discovered the 1940s radio story, and how his own personal experiences as a Chinese American helped him expand upon that story for his adaptation. Now, if you haven't read Superman Smashes the Klan, I seriously can't recommend it enough. It's so heartfelt and fun. It thoughtfully deals with complex issues like racism, but it also tells a really exciting Superman story. It's no easy feat to balance all of these things, and Gene and I kind of talk about how he did find that balance. I think he pulled it off beautifully. So I really hope you enjoy listening to this episode. Again, subscribe, share with some super friends if you like what you're hearing, and stay tuned for more. Let's go ahead and celebrate Superman with Gene Luen Yang.
Now available to own on video cassette.
Gene, what a lovely opportunity to be able to speak with you, one of my favorite Superman writers. Welcome. Thank you for hanging out.
Thank you for having me, Shawn. I'm excited to be here.
I want to start off with learning a little bit about you as a comic book writer, illustrator. You've been doing this for a minute, but you started as a kid, drawing and things like that, and just kind of never stopped, never looked back from there.
I did. I became a comic book fan when I was in the 5th grade. The very first comic of my collection actually featured Superman. It was DC Comics Presents number 57, which had Superman in it, and it also had the Atomic Knights. And then pretty shortly after that, I started making my own comics. My best friend in 5th grade was this kid named Jeremy Kuniyoshi, and at lunchtime we would draw comics together. Then when we finished, we would give our originals to his mom, who would photocopy them for us, and then we sold those at school. It was a ton of fun. That was like the beginning of my comic book career.
Do you remember what the stories were, what the characters were?
Oh yeah. It was all like rip-offs of superheroes, because this was the 80s. So back then there just wasn't a lot of genre diversity within American comics.
Right.
Most of what we were reading were superhero comics. So we made up a superhero. His name was the Hunter. He had this discus of death that he would throw at people's heads. That was about it.
I mean, that sounds amazing. This needs to make a comeback. I think we need a reboot of this. I remember when I was, and I think maybe 2nd, 3rd grade was when I started writing, and my books were just horrendous ripoffs of my favorite movies. So I wrote Jurassic Park 3,
Oh, there you
The
go.
Lost World had not been released yet, but I knew it
Okay.
was coming. So I was like, I'm going to jump the gun here and I'm just going to go ahead and get them something for Jurassic Park 3. And the plot of it was more than suspiciously identical to the first Jurassic Park,
Oh, I see. I
which
see.
it raised a bunch of questions about why are Alan Grant and Ellie Sattler willfully going back to this island where terrible things happen and acting like nothing went wrong there. So
I thought you were going to tell me that it was suspiciously like the Lost World, so they ripped you off.
no, not that creative. Not that creative. I only had Jurassic Park to work with, so it was just Jurassic Park again, but
I
like
see.
slight differences. Just and
Okay.
when I say slight, I mean it was just Jurassic Park, but the
Okay.
title 3 on it. So Superman was I mean, it was literally the first comic you had, and you said
Yeah.
the Atomic Knights. Do you remember anything else as far as exposure to Superman?
Oh yeah, of course, of course. I mean, the Christopher Reeve movie came out when I was really young. My mom took us to go see it. I think we saw the first one and the second one in the theaters. And then I mean, he was just all over. Like he was on T-shirts. I had like this little puzzle book that I bought from the book fair at my school that was all Superman themed. But the first like proper comic that I bought had Superman in it. I
Was
do have to
that
say though, by the time I was in fifth grade, I was not much of a Superman fan. I actually thought he was like kind of a
lame?
boring, yeah, like
Yeah.
the most boring of all of the superheroes.
Who did you get into at that point?
Well, pretty soon after that, I discovered our local comic book store, and I would beg my mom to take me every weekend. Every now and then, she would relent. I very quickly became a Marvel fan, so
Yeah.
I loved everything in the Marvel universe.
Yeah, and Marvel at that point was really like they had the market cornered. They had all the
Yeah,
like
yeah,
the
yeah,
very very human characters and the very human
yeah.
stories. So it
That's
makes
right.
sense.
That's right.
And that I mean John Byrne coming in 86, which was when they kind of applied that more to Superman. At that point like yeah, Marvel was really
Yeah, Marvel was kind of killing it. I mean, it was an interesting time in the Marvel universe, right? Like, I think Spider-Man had just gotten his black suit. The Thing had left Fantastic Four, and She-Hulk had joined. There's just a lot going on.
was there a moment when you kind of got back into Superman?
Yeah, well, eventually, I think this happens to a lot of collectors. Is you start paying more attention to the creators than you do the characters, right? You start realizing, oh, I like this writer or I like this artist, and that as I got older, it kind of led me back into DC world. I mean, Alan Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow was a big thing,
Right.
and I think and much later there was the Howard Porter and Grant Morrison run on JLA. That was pretty impressive. There's a lot of stuff.
Brought you back over. You were like,
Yeah,
okay,
that's right.
Superman, you know what? Maybe not so bad. All
Yeah,
right, I
I mean
got you.
nowadays I think I mean I'm a huge Superman fan now. In part because I got to work on the character, but in part also I realized like at some point you learn about comic book history and you realize oh Superman is actually the beginning of all of it. Like if you like Spider-Man, if you like Batman, if you like Wonder Woman, it doesn't matter. Any superhero they owe something to Superman. He's the granddaddy of them all.
Yeah, and I think, it's one of those things where you go through that rebellious teenage phase of like, I don't care. I don't care. I'm going to
Yeah,
stay
yeah,
out
yeah.
late and I'm going to eat all the candy. Like clearly
Yeah, that's right.
incredibly
And I'm gonna
I
read
had a
Daredevil. Yeah, yeah. That's right.
I'm going to read
Yeah.
Frank Miller
Yeah.
Daredevil. Yeah, and so like you go through that phase of maybe, Superman is the establishment, quote
Yeah,
unquote,
that's right.
where, you have Batman who's like edgy and like,
Yeah.
all right, awesome. And Superman is like, well, I don't know if we should be doing that. And kind of gives off that impression of like, well, you know what? Let's put that over there. Let's relegate it over here. I'm experiencing complex emotions now
Yeah,
and I don't
that's
have
right.
time
That's
for
right.
this. But then as you get older, what's funny is you kind of, and I think this is what Donner's Superman film did so well, because I think maybe people who didn't grow up watching that film or weren't around when the film first came out, they look at
Mhm.
it and feel like, oh, it's a little antiquated. And that was kind of the point of the film, is Superman saying truth, justice, and the American way in post Watergate
Yeah.
America
Yeah.
was like, and even Lois's reaction to that, like, wow, you're gonna run every politician out of the country, is kind of the point. Like, and you
Yeah.
realize there is an appeal to that, and especially as politics and things get kind of crazy and upended. Like I think what happens is as you get older, there's a comfort to Superman, but also a recognition of what makes that character special, that you might gravitate at first towards the grungy and the edgy,
Yeah.
but there's
Yeah.
something really powerful about somebody
Yeah.
who can be upstanding and say like, no, I'm going to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think the grungy and the edgy needs Superman, right? They need a standard bearer to kind of push up against. Whereas the reverse isn't necessarily true. Like Superman can stand on his own. Like the
Yeah.
boys, on
Yes.
both the comic and the show. That show doesn't work if Superman hadn't set up what it means to be a superhero in the first
Yes.
place.
Yeah, absolutely. So you kind of started off, you had this passion for writing and drawing and wanted to study art from what I understood. But
Yeah,
your
that's right.
parents, as all great parents do, say, that sounds nice, Gene, but also maybe something a little bit more practical. So did you end up studying? I think, did you minor in art and kind of focus more on computer science?
Well, I do also like computer science. That was one of my
Yeah.
favorite classes in high school. But had it been left entirely up to me, I would have gone to art school. My parents were not having it. They were, they're both immigrants. They were just like, we worked so hard to make it in this country. You're not going to blow it on art school. So I ended up going to college. My original plan was to double major. I was going to double major in art and computer science. But then as I moved through the art program, I realized that was just not for me. Like what I wanted was, I think, like pretty intensive figure drawing classes with a lot of emphasis on anatomy. And the art program at my college was just not that. It was much more abstract, which has its place, but that was not what I wanted because I was a comic book fan. I wanted to
Right.
be able to draw the way.
People, you're drawing real people, or
Yeah,
well, quote
yeah,
unquote real people, real situations,
yeah. That's right.
fantastical situations, but with people.
That's right. That's right. So I ended up stopping art classes, and I took these creative writing classes instead. I ended up getting a minor in creative writing, and that minor nowadays is much more useful to me than my major, for sure. Despite what my dad said. Yeah, my creative writing minor was much more useful.
You do hear that story a lot with a lot of creative people who have gone on to make it, and a lot of creative people who haven't. But you do want that kind of practical, kind of the safety net. Like you want to think
Yeah, yeah,
practically,
yeah.
and you do want to think about that. But it's always a wonderful victory where you can turn that argument on its head and say, like, well, look, this ended up being more beneficial to me in the long run in my professional career, the creative side. So
Yeah, that's right.
it's
That's
it's
exactly right.
always a good reminder and good encouragement and inspiration to hear those kinds
Yeah.
of stories. So I loved finding that out. And you ended up like when you graduated, what was your career looking like at the time?
Right after I graduated, I found a job as a software developer. So I worked for a very small company based out of Emeryville, California, the same city where Pixar is now. And I was there for 2 years, and then I left and I became a computer science teacher at a high school in Oakland. So I was at that. I really love that job. I was
Yeah.
there for 17 years. I was doing comics on the side as I was teaching high school.
So tell me a little bit about that, balancing that creative and that passion with a full-time job. That's something that I know myself, I love writing and I have to balance that
Mm,
with my kind of like, here is my big boy professional office job.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah.
also finding the time and energy to write and create. Tell me, like, was that tough finding that balance? Did you ever have a moment where you're kind of like, you know what, I guess this probably just isn't going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I actually went into thinking it was not going to happen. I remember this is the '90s now. I went to my very first Comic Con in San Diego, and um, San Diego Comic Con in the 1990s is not what it is today.
Yeah.
The very
That
first
was a
Comic
dark,
Con that I went
dark
to,
time for comic
it
books.
was you could buy tickets at the door, and I remember being there on the Sunday, and on that exhibit floor, it felt like there were more exhibitors than there were attendees. And I would go to these
Wow.
panels, to listen to my favorite publishers and editors and authors and artists. And they were talking about how we might be seeing the death of the American comic book. Well, I
Mm.
remember one of the writers talked about how epic poetry used to be a mass medium, and then it eventually kind of shrank and shrank and shrank, and now it's this very niche thing that
Mm.
a very small group of writers write for a very small group of readers. And his prediction was, given the way the comic book market was going, that was going to happen to the American comic book. So at that point, I was like, I'm not going to make a living at this, And my favorite artist, I remember hearing Art Adams, he's one of my favorites, talking about how to make ends meet, he had to also illustrate for video game magazines.
Mm.
And I was like, if Art Adams has to get other work in order to make ends meet, I'm not gonna make it, right? Like, it's just not a thing.
I remember a different medium, but Charlie Kaufman, the famed
Mm,
screenwriter, he
yeah,
did
yeah, yeah.
something a couple years ago where he was talking about how he's like, my career is a failure. I don't. And I'm like, if Charlie Kaufman's talking about, like, this is the guy who wrote Adaptation and Eternal
Yeah,
Sunshine
yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah.
Spotless Mind, if this guy's talking about, like, I feel like a failure as a screenwriter or a writer, then that's things are not
Yeah.
looking well in that
Yeah,
industry
that's
too.
exactly how it felt. That's exactly
Yeah,
how it felt. So my plan then was to teach full time and then do comics on the side. And I figured some people, waste money on golf, and I'm gonna waste money publishing my own comics, like
perfect.
self-publishing my own comics. So that's what I did for years. I got involved in a community that's based in the San Francisco Bay Area of other cartoonists. We were all in our 20s and early 30s, and we all kind of wanted to do the same thing. So we would get together once a week, give each other pointers. And I felt like I never went to art school. That was kind of like my art school. I
Yeah.
learned how to make comics by being involved in that community.
And I watched your fantastic TED Talk, which is
Oh,
great. Just
thank
about
you.
yeah. I mean, it was wonderful, and I love the thesis of it, and we'll definitely talk about that. But you tell a great story about how you were trying to figure out ways to engage with the classroom and engage with students and finding a way to really connect with them and make the material interesting. And you tried a bunch of things. You tried videos. You tried things like that just weren't working. And then at a certain point, you realized that your illustrations and your ability as an artist and kind of your love for comics ended up being the missing piece and the way
That's
to
right.
connect with students.
That's
So
right.
how,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
what was that like? Just recount that a little bit and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was teaching at the school for a few years, and then one of my colleagues in the math department was going on long-term leave, so they asked me to take over their class. But at the same time, I was also serving as the school's educational technologist, which just meant I would help other teachers integrate technology into their classrooms. So for this class that I was taking over as a long-term sub, once every couple of weeks I would have to miss a day because I'd be in some other classroom helping some other teacher. And I just thought that that was horrible for these students, right? Like, having a sub is not ideal, but then you're going to get a sub for your sub. That's just like the worst educational
Right.
environment, right? And in the beginning, to make up for my absences, I would actually deliver these video lectures, and my students just hated it. They thought it was boring. They felt like it was really hard to follow. One of the students came up and was like, Mr. Yang, you are even more boring on video than you are in person, And as like
You're
a
like, thank
desperate, I
you for
know,
that constructive feedback. I appreciate it.
teenagers, right? So as a desperate second attempt, I started drawing my lectures as comics, and then I would Xerox them and ask my sub to hand those out. And those ended up being a hit. Surprisingly, I had thought that kids would be more into the screen than they would be into the page.
Hmm.
But when I investigated, um, I discovered, like, my students told me first they like the visual nature of comics, that things were pictorial. I think we were doing factoring at the time, and seeing the process of factoring being broken down panel by panel was very helpful to them. And second is, unlike the video, with the comic, you can actually go as quickly or as slowly as you want. Like, the
Hmm.
the student can read it as quickly or as slowly as they want.
Right.
So that, just like, I was doing my master's in education at a local college at Cal State East Bay at the time. And originally, I was going to do my master's final project on something technology related, but I pivoted to making it comics related, because of that experience.
Was that kind of a creative breakthrough for you as well in your own writing? Like, kind of realizing, like, it's educational and it's specific to, like, computer science and things that are a bit more technical in nature, but I am kind of telling a story. I'm kind of transforming this into a lesson. Or is this something that was kind of like inherent to your experience as a teacher?
No, I think it definitely changed me as a teacher. It just made me think a lot more about the role of sequential images in teaching. Even when I'm teaching on a whiteboard, sometimes I'll draw as part of the
Hmm.
lesson. So I think there's something very, very powerful about sequential images. One great, everyday example of this are the the instructions that come with Legos. Those are essentially comics. They're images in sequence, right? And I would argue that those instructions work best as comics. Like you definitely could not do it in text. That'd be crazy to try to give
Right.
Lego instructions in text. But even as video, I think different kids will build at different rates. So if you have a video, the video might be going too fast or too slow for an individual builder. The individual builder needs to have control over how quickly or slowly the
Yeah.
instructions go by, and that's why Lego instructions as comics works best. So that's just one example, but I think there are lots of examples of subjects that are best explained through comics.
No, that's a great example. So when you started working on American Born Chinese, that was the big breakthrough for you? And what kind of, I guess, what was the creative background for that? What was at a certain point you're realizing, like, you know what, this is the story I want to tell, something a little bit more personal?
Yeah. American Born Chinese definitely was a turning point. I mean, in practical terms, that was the moment that I stopped losing money every time I put out a comic. Before that,
Right.
every single time I put out a comic, I would lose money. So I'd been doing comics for maybe 5 years at that point. I'd done a bunch of self-published comics. I had done a 2-issue miniseries with a friend for Image Comics. I'd also gotten to do some work with slave labor graphics, but all of it was still like, I was working as a full time teacher while I was doing all this. And at some point, I realized, I'd always had these stories with Asian American protagonists, but I'd never had a story where it focused on Asian American identity. So
Mm.
I knew I wanted to do something like that because my own cultural heritage is just such an important part of how I find my place in the world. It was a real source of tension when I was a kid, and then it was something I had to work through to become like a fully functional adult. So I wanted to have some kind of story where that was the focus, and that ended up being American Born Chinese.
That's awesome. And then that kind of opened up the doors for you. I mean, professionally is now a word I've
Yes,
decided.
yes, I
Professionally,
agree.
professionally, creatively, that was what kicked the doors open and kind of got you on, I guess, the higher ups radars. That kind of allowed for
Yeah,
the doors to be opened at Marvel and DC. Was it DC that you first started, like, as far as like the big boys territory? Now was Superman, the New 52, and the New Superman, was that kind of how you
yeah,
started out there?
yeah. That's right. That's right. So I had actually American Born Chinese, getting American Born Chinese published was essentially a result of me being involved in that community in San Francisco. And I think I tell young artists all the time, like, if you're just starting off, one of the most important things that you can do is find artists that are around your same age, around the same spot in their careers, whose work you admire, and build a community through that, right? So,
Yeah.
so what would happen in that little community is when one of us would make a contact with a publisher, we would kind of try to pull everybody else back in. So I had a friend named Derek Kirk Kim, really talented, won all 3 major comic book industry awards. One year he won an Eisner, an Ignatz, and a Harvey. And then he was the one that introduced me to my eventual editor at First Second Books, which is the publishing house for American Born Chinese. And that totally changed my career, changed my
Yeah.
life.
Well, it's an important reminder, don't sit around playing with somebing else's toy or waiting to play with somebody else's
Yeah,
toys.
that's
Do your
right. That's
thing. Like,
right.
do your thing.
That's
Make it
right.
happen with whatever
Yeah.
resources are available to you. And then those doors could open up and you could
Yeah,
find
that's
yourself
right.
in a position where you do get to play with the big toys. So,
I think the response to American Born Chinese ultimately was what ended up getting the attention of both Marvel and DC. So it was DC first. DC
mm,
I'd been in touch with DC for a while. Like, one of their editors had reached out to me, and we talked about different projects over the years. But I really like teaching. In after American Born Chinese came out, I became a part-time teacher. We were on a block schedule, so I would stay home one day working on my comic, and then the next day I would go on campus to teach. And for
mm.
years, that's how my life worked. I was half teacher and half cartoonist. That balance I really loved, and I was very reluctant to give it up. So they had actually contacted me about a couple of other projects, and for each of them, I just felt like if I take that on, I'm gonna have to leave teaching.
Right.
But eventually in 2014, they were like, how would you feel about writing Superman? And at that point, I couldn't
That's
say
the
no.
breaking point.
Yeah,
It's like, how do you say no to that?
yeah, that was when I decided I had to leave teaching. So I've been full time since then.
And what was it like? Just, I mean, getting into that world and realizing, like, oh my god, I'm about to write a Superman comic. Like, how do
Yeah,
you prepare yourself mentally for that?
it was incredible, but it was also really, really scary. It was
Mm,
scary on multiple levels. One is my wife and I, we have 4 kids. They were
mm,
fairly young at the time. I was leaving this pretty secure job, and even though the paycheck wasn't big, it was still regular.
right.
So I was able to, and my school community was very understanding. I got health insurance through them.
Mm,
So to leave all of that was really scary. And then the other scary part was I was jumping into like this superhero universe that I had loved since I was a kid. That's arguably one of the top maybe 4 or 5 fictional universes
yeah.
in the world. And then I was jumping on the granddaddy superhero of them all. So it was very, very scary and very
The
intimidating.
stakes are suddenly very, very
Yes,
high. Yeah.
it was very high. I was lucky as well in that when I started writing Superman, Greg Pak, who's a really good friend of mine, he was writing action,
Mm.
and he kind of ended up being my mentor into the world of superhero comics. It's really different. It's really different from writing graphic novels, which is
Yeah.
what I had been doing up until then.
What was some of the best advice you got from Greg about writing for?
He told me that writing superhero comics within a living universe like the DC universe is kind of like improv. You got to treat it
Mm,
like improv. In graphic novels, or in like a standalone miniseries, you actually have complete control over the entire world, and you can plan things out meticulously. But when you're writing in a living universe, things happen in other books that'll change what happens in your book, and you just have to be okay with that. Like you have
right.
to
It's
write like
it's
improv.
the yes and instead of
Yeah, that's right.
the
The yes and.
denial in terms of improvisation.
Yeah.
I gotcha. So at what point did Superman Smashes the Klan come along? You'd been doing the New 52 Superman,
That's
and then
right.
you'd also done New Superman for the DC Rebirth run.
Yeah, that's
So
right. That's right.
you were already kind of well embedded in this universe now, and you'd been working a little
Yeah.
bit. So when did the conversation start happening around making a kind of an adaptation of this famous radio story?
Yeah, I became friends with Marie Javins, who
Mhm.
is a legend within superhero comics. We were at a book event together. It might have been like an ALA meeting or something, but we had breakfast, and she told me that DC was going to start this line of young reader graphic novels, which I think is just an incredible idea. So when I was a kid, and if you were to go to my 5th grade class and ask who read comics, maybe I don't know, a fourth of the kids would raise their hands, and they'd all be boys, right?
Mm,
But nowadays, if you go to my kids' class and you ask who reads comics, every single hand goes up. They don't necessarily read like superhero comics the way I
right.
did when I was a kid, but every kid is reading some form of comic or graphic novel. Every single kid in that class. So the growth that comics as a medium has experienced since then has just been tremendous. So I think when DC wanted to do this young reader line, middle grade to young adult, I
Mm.
just thought it was a brilliant idea. It's a way of um, engaging a new audience, a new generation with the DC characters. So Marie and I, we had this meeting, and I threw out this idea that I just had forever about adapting this old Superman radio show, and she was immediately on board.
So you knew, so you had been familiar with that radio show
Yeah, yeah,
already.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'd read about it. I'd read about it in Freakonomics. They have this
Mm,
whole chapter about it. So I'd been thinking about it ever since. One of the reasons why it fascinated me was because it shows that fiction can have real world consequences.
yeah.
Because one of the things that happened after that radio show aired, this show about the Man of Steel taking on these robed and hooded racists, is that the real life membership of the KKK dropped because people were just too embarrassed to join this
Isn't that
this
amazing?
group. Yeah, it's amazing.
Because you talk, I mean, as you know, I think in general, people love these characters and they love
Yes.
Superman, but you don't necessarily think of it as, I guess, like having those kinds of real world
Yeah,
implications. And I
that's right.
remember recounting to some, just explaining like, oh, I'm going to be talking to Gene Yang about Superman Smashes the Klan, and oh, what's that? Tell me more about that. I'm like, well, it's based on this story that actually Superman back in the good old days with the radio show, like did this whole story about the KKK, and it had, I mean, the KKK, quote unquote,
Yeah,
obviously for
yeah,
legal reasons, it couldn't be the Ku
yeah.
Klux
That's right.
Klan, but
That's
it
right.
was the Klan
It
overall.
was basically
But
the Klan.
it
Yeah,
was the
yeah,
Klan.
yeah,
So I remember telling them, and I was like, in this radio show, like actually, like Superman actually, life imitated art. Superman
yeah,
beat the Klan, and there is actual empirical data. Like there's data that exists that shows that this had a real impact,
yeah.
and that it's
That's
a
right.
really, I think it's sometimes you can take for granted how important these kinds of stories are until you can actually set it up with those bullet points and say like,
Yeah,
this is how, like, look at the positive impact that these heroes can have in real life. Like we
yeah.
want to
That's right.
believe in these characters and we accept that they don't actually exist, but when they do cross over into real world issues, look at this incredible impact.
I mean, it's validating for anybody who's into like geek culture, right? That it's not
Yes.
just about entertainment; that it also has these real world consequences, which I
Yeah.
just found fascinating. Yeah, so that was what made me aware of the original Clan of the Fiery Cross storyline from that old Superman radio show.
And so you had already connected to it and you were like, I kind of want to do that story.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What was the reaction to that? Because this is obviously, it could be seen as a touchy story. It could be kind of like,
Yes,
oh, we don't necessarily want to ruffle any feathers. Like, so was there
yes.
any, not pushback, but was there kind of a conversation about like, let's think about this. Like, how would
No,
we do it?
Marie was immediately on board, but she also was very wary and careful. So she
Mm,
actually um, decided to edit it herself. I think in part because of that, because she knew that it was going to be a very touchy thing. So um, we she asked me what artists I wanted to work with. I gave her a teeny tiny short list, and at the very top was Guru Hiru,
mm,
who I had worked with on the Avatar comics. I felt like they what we wanted was something we knew immediately we wanted to set it in the 1940s, the same time period that the original show was set. But we wanted it to feel both old timey and modern,
mm.
and I just thought that they would be the perfect artists to pull that off, and they totally were.
That's
They
beautiful
were
art.
great. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, they're
So,
really amazing. But Marie and I just went back and forth a lot, all
yeah.
the way through the entire book.
How did you I mean, there, it already had kind of that Chinese American connection for you personally.
Yes,
The story, it's in the original story,
it's
and
in the original story. Yeah,
so you had that emotional connection. What was it like, kind of, once you realized like, oh, I get to tell this story, expanding upon it, and how did you find your personal into it, aside from that, like, you created this character, or well, not created, but you expanded on
yeah,
Roberta. She kind of
that's right.
becomes the driving protagonist of the story versus Tommy. So when was Roberta the character that really, once you kind of figured out, you know what, I want to focus on her, was that what opened the doors for you creatively, or what was that process like?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up doing a lot of reading. Like the first thing I wanted to answer was why the um, the original writers of that show did not use an African American family.
Yeah.
I just felt like if you at least take a cursory look at the history of America, that seemed like it would be the most obvious choice. And the answer I discovered was that I mean it's not a pleasant answer.
Right. Right.
It's that at the beginning of
We're still in Jim Crow, like in
yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah.
pre civil rights movement.
That's
So
right. That's right. It's pre-civil rights movement. So at the beginning of World War II, America realized that China was our greatest ally against the Empire of Japan. Like right after Pearl Harbor, that was a realization. So because of that, there was this rehabilitation of Chinese Americans. Before World War II, Chinese Americans were seen as like criminals. Chinatown was where you would go to buy drugs or
mm,
get mugged. And then almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, Chinese Americans became like loyal and hardworking, ideal citizens,
right.
and a lot of that was because America wanted to build this relationship with China against
Mhm.
Japan. So that story persisted all the way through the war. Chinese American soldiers were allowed to integrate into all white regiments within the army, which no other minority group was able to do.
Mm,
And then after the war, Chinese American soldiers were able to take advantage of the GI Bill to move into formerly white neighborhoods in a way
right.
that African Americans and Japanese Americans and Mexican Americans, any other minority group was not allowed to do. So I think it was just a reflection of what was actually happening.
Right.
You
It
know,
made the most sense for it to be a
yeah, that's
Asian
right.
American family. I gotcha.
So I looked into that, and then Roberta exists in the radio show, but she's
Mm,
not named. She's just mentioned in a line of dialogue. Like there's a line of dialogue where I think Tommy and his dad are talking, and they mention that there's a mom and a sister in the picture. But neither of those characters are ever on the radio. We never
mm,
hear their voices, and I think that appealed to me, that the fact that um it was just this wide open space to
mm.
define this character, right? Even Tommy, he gets a decent amount of airtime, uh but I felt like if I went with his sister, it was just like almost like a blank slate. Like I could
Yeah.
really figure her out
Yeah,
if I made
absolutely.
her the protagonist.
Well, and I think also what's so brilliant about it is this is such a rich story to pull from. Like you've already got great material to work with. I think the story could have been great on its own, but what ends up elevating it even more, like the you're dealing with some heavy subject matter and a rich story, but you also find a space for Superman to tell kind of a, a semi origin tale of like Superman accepting his heritage and his background and his legacy as an alien as well, not just
Yeah.
like a foreigner, but an actual alien, and being very very similar to Roberta and Tommy in that way, and discovering his powers and who he is. And that was I mean the first time I read it, I remember thinking like, this is really cool, because this is like going the extra story mile for something to make it really like it's Roberta and Tommy's story, but it's a great Superman story too. And at what point did you decide, like, you know what? I want to kind of explore the idea of like, this is the official transition from when Superman was leaping tall buildings to actually flying and
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
that. At what point did you decide that was going to be a part of the story as well?
I mean, it was pretty early on. I at that point I had become a huge Superman fan, and one of the things that drew me to the character was this realization that he actually is an immigrant. And maybe he's boring for the same reason my own immigrant parents are boring. Like my parents are like, rule followers. They try to do everything right, and when I was a kid, I didn't understand why, but as an adult, I began to realize, oh, it's because um, they're a little bit worried. Like deep down inside, they're a little worried if they start breaking rules, people will kind of point out that they don't necessarily belong.
Mm,
So I apply that same logic to Superman. Superman is an immigrant, and maybe deep down inside, the reason why he's such seen as a rule follower, at least, is because deep down inside, he's worried that people are going to question
yeah.
his belongingness.
Yeah, and that's always been a part of Superman's character, is that one thing he wants that he can never have. And again, this also speaks to, I think, the people who have done such a great job telling great Superman stories, and I
Yeah,
include you on this list, understand that inherently, like, people who think Superman is boring, I think, are missing the point and are missing what's exciting about this character. And one of the things that is exciting about Superman and very relatable is that feeling of like,
yeah,
I can never be one of them.
that's right.
Ultimately, I'm always going to be an other, and I want
That's right.
nothing more than to be part of this. I will do my best to be a part of this, but ultimately I'm not. It's one of the things that I think haunts Superman, and
Yeah.
I thought your story did such a beautiful job of really emphasizing that, but also this incredible story about the clan of the Fiery Cross and all these racial tensions in America, just like bringing those two together in such a fun and incredible and ultimately emotional way.
Well, thank you, thank you. I mean, I think a lot of that is because of the way Superman was created. Right, he was created by these sons of immigrants, these
Hmm.
sons of Jewish immigrants from Europe, and he was created at a time when it was just not easy to be of Jewish descent in an American setting. And I think that's sort of the entire superhero genre. I think has that in its foundation. This idea that you kind of have to hide who you are just to get through your day.
Yes.
All the superheroes, almost all the superheroes have that, right?
Yeah, and I can't remember if it was Joe or Jerry's father, but like you read about and you write about this a
Yeah,
little bit in your kind of afterword to this story, but I think if you're not that familiar with the story of Superman and the origin and creation of Superman, you don't realize that one of the co-creators, their father was murdered basically
yeah,
during a bank robbery.
that's right.
And you think about that and how that must have impacted and affected them, and then suddenly Superman comes out of that. And I don't remember the exact timeline or chain of events, but they had written an earlier version of Superman that was like evil and trying to
Yeah,
take
that's
over the
right.
world. But then suddenly, somewhere in there, that switches and Superman becomes the champion of the oppressed. And
Yeah,
it's very true. Like that is in the DNA of Superman. That idea of the immigrant and feeling like you need to hide, but then getting your chance to really shine and put
yeah,
yourself
that's
out
right.
there. I love just the way you kind of you're able to kind of touch on all this different subject matter in a very, very fun, lighthearted way, which is crazy. Like the book is never, it's never bogged down in kind of the intensity of it. It doesn't shy away from it. It's not like it's very head on and very like just like this is what we're dealing with. These are like awful, awful perspectives and points of view. But I almost love because it's from the kid's perspective. And Superman, I've always seen Superman as kind of a big kid in general. That kind of innocence and the way he perceives the world has that sort of wide-eyed curiosity and love that a kid has. But I think because you're looking at it through those eyes and through those kids' eyes, you're approaching this stuff in a more not innocent way, but it allows for that kind of lightheartedness to keep things kind of fun and light. What was the challenge there of just kind of like dealing with that subject matter, but also finding the balance of the humor and the humanity in there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge. It was a challenge, but we had a lot of inspiration from the source material. You know, the source material was made for kids, but it dealt with all of these heavy subjects. And you can find it now on YouTube. You can find all
Mm,
16 episodes on YouTube. Some pieces are definitely dated, you know, but I would say that given the fact that it is what 80 years old now, a large parts of it really will really hold up. You
yeah,
know, I think the writers really did a good job on
yeah,
that radio show, and then I also think like Marie as my editor, she was just so careful and so thoughtful all the way through. It was very we knew we wanted to write that line. We wanted to talk about adult subjects,
mm,
but in a way that is accessible to kids. So she was really good about that.
yeah.
I do also like my editor on New Superman is a guy named Paul Kaminsky, who's like the head of the Superman group now. I think right. He's
Yes.
pretty high up there within
Yeah.
Superman now, and he's like yeah, he's one of the best superhero editors I've ever worked with. He just has a real natural instinct. So he gave me a couple notes just on the side. You know, he wasn't even officially on the project. He gave me a couple notes on the side that were super super helpful.
Is there a particular moment in that story that you were super, super proud of that you developed or came up with, or a story beat or a character moment? Like, and it doesn't even have to be a big, big thing. It could just be like a goofy line that, like, really, really you're very
Yeah,
proud
I
of.
the thing I really wanted to do was I wanted to make the first time you see Superman using his heat vision a moment, you
Mm,
know, and and I think like I look at that page that Gurihiru drew, and I think it is right.
yeah.
That's something that if you read a lot of Superman comics, you kind of take for granted. But this
Yeah.
guy is shooting lasers out of his eyes. That's a crazy
Right.
thing, you
Right.
know. And I
Well, I
wanted
also
it to
like
feel crazy.
the way you talk about the flight too, like the flying, like,
Yeah.
it's presented in a way where Superman has been holding back because he fears like fully embracing that otherness and his heritage and what people will think of him. And I just love there's a line close to the end where Jimmy is like, "Oh my god, Superman flies now? I don't know if I'll ever get used to seeing that." And it is that moment where like you realize, having read this story and like getting used to Superman leaping and not being able to fly, you're like, "Oh my god, that's so brilliant." Because of course, what's the one of the big things you associate with Superman is
Yeah, yeah,
flight,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that was
yeah,
not how it started. But
yeah. That was not how it started. Yeah, I when I started working on the monthly Superman comic, I read a bunch of old Superman comics, and that was something that really struck me. You know, he's like running across telephone lines, and he's
yes,
just yeah leaping buildings, but not flying over them.
Right. And
Uh,
apparently, and I don't know if this is true. I haven't actually looked up whether this is true, but the radio show is where the flying was introduced as the power.
yeah, I
So
read that too.
it makes sense. I mean, it almost works perfectly that, Superman Smashes the Klan is based on the radio show,
Yeah,
and the
that's right.
story would focus on like the leaping becoming flying. So in a way, it's all connected. It's
Yeah,
all
it's all
connected. It was
connected.
all
Everything's
all meant to
connected. That's
be.
right.
Well, this story, it ended up coming out in late 2019, I want to
Yeah,
say.
that's right.
I read it in 2021 in the midst of COVID, in the midst of just the insane the racial tensions that had happened, everything that had kind of been
Yeah.
boiling and came to the surface in 2020. And reading it during that time, it was both a wow, I'm so glad this story is out right now, and also kind of a reflective, like, it's kind of sad how relevant this feels
Yeah,
today,
yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, yeah. I had that same feeling.
But what was that like, kind of seeing, because it did, I mean, the story, I remember it being released and being so beloved and so acclaimed, but then I'm sure it must have taken on a whole new life in the midst of all of that insanity.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it fit into a conversation within the culture that
Yeah.
was happening right when it was being published. So I think it started coming out in late in 2019. The collection I think came out maybe in 2020,
Mm.
maybe right in the middle of all that.
Yeah.
So it was, I think I was very happy with the way it came out, but it was also uh, a little bit disheartening how
Yes.
relevant the themes are still,
Yeah.
to the culture.
Well, we also look to art, I think, in stories to reflect and meditate on what's going on, and
Yeah,
in a way
that's
they
right.
can kind of shine a light in the right direction. So I think, the sad thing is, you do look at that and you say, like, I wish it didn't have to be that way, but also you read it and you are encouraged. You can say, like, you know what, we've faced this before, we can face it again, and
Yeah,
we can get in touch with our better angels and instincts to rise above this kind of stuff. And I think that's what Superman represents, honestly, as
yeah,
a whole, is
absolutely,
kind of the
absolutely.
potential of humanity. And
Yeah,
I mean, I feel like that's probably what makes him so special. But I mean, for you, what makes Superman so special, and what has made him endure for all this time?
I'd read somewhere, someone smarter than me, you might know who. I don't remember who said that Superman. The ultimate fantasy about Superman is that somebody can be all powerful and still be good, and
Yeah,
I think
I've heard
that's
that.
what it
I've heard
is.
that too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we as humanity, like we're getting more and more powerful, right? Through our technology. And I think there's always this fear that as we get more powerful, we're going to become more and more corrupt. But I
Yeah.
think Superman gives us sort of uh, a light to aim for,
Yeah.
that we, it might be possible for us to become more powerful, but still retain our goodness.
Yeah, it feels more inspiring nowadays. I think it's, back in the day it might have seemed lame. Nowadays it feels even more necessary to have an
Yeah.
example like
Yeah.
that.
I agree.
And then, as an extension, comic books, and this is where your TED Talk comes in, but like the importance of comics and how they are kind of looked down on. Superheroes as well. I think
Yep.
Superman is, you kind of can see it as juvenile, but you have seen firsthand the impact that comic books have. So just the importance of comics, like, what do you feel like, what do they have to offer that no other medium does?
I mean, I think comics are, of all of the visual storytelling media, comics are the most intimate, right? Like if you compare comics to animation or film or television, and I love all of those things, comics can be done by a single person or a very, very small team of people. And the experience of reading it is also very intimate. I think the connection that a reader can experience with the creator or creators, to my mind, is unparalleled. When you're looking at a comic, you're actually looking at the movements of a person's hand across a page,
Hmm.
and I think there's nothing that beats that.
Yeah. And do you have, this is kind of this is a question that's been thrown out by friends of mine. My friends Brad and Lisa Gullickson at the Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast have been asking Superman creators and writers and artists this. And there was a great video DC just released where a bunch of amazing artists and creators were asked this question. But for you, if you have the chance, let's say you happen to run into some people after they've come out of James Gunn's new film. They are so
Okay.
pumped up. They are so excited. They're like, I've got to get into I never knew Superman was so awesome. Aside from Superman Smashes the Klan, which of course you're going to have that in your back pocket. You're like, well, if you liked that, you're going to love this. What other Superman stories would you recommend to blossoming Superman fans or people who now want to dive into some great Superman stories in the comic realm?
I think John Byrne's run, which you had mentioned earlier, is really fun. I think Superman Birthright is great. I think Mark Waid's work on World's Finest, which is still happening right now, right, is a really fun run. I just think there's something very classically superhero in Mark Waid, and it just comes out in everything he writes.
Yes, yeah,
you know,
he understands. He gets Superman. It's always wonderful to hear him talk about Superman.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think all of those are really. I mean, I also love like Kingdom Come. I think it's okay for a brand new reader. Yeah, I think it still works.
Yeah. How do you feel? Are you excited for James Gunn's movie?
I am excited. Yeah.
Do you
I'm
get
totally
to?
excited.
I've been asked because it's fun. I mean, like I'm on the outside and like I'm pumped and I'm ready and I'm a massive Superman fan. But it's what's it like being like you're part of the family. You're part of this creative team, but you also get to experience this new film that like everybody's talking about. What's it like seeing those trailers? Is there anything that is
been great?
Yeah.
No, I think the trailers just got me super excited. My geek friends and I, my comic book friends and I talk about it all the time, right? Like the fact that Crypto showed up and then Mr. Terrific and Hawkgirl, you just can't like and Guy Gardner too, right? It's really amazing.
All these deep cuts.
Yeah.
It's great because
these deep cuts.
James Gunn is he's such a great filmmaker, but he's so clearly a fan of comic books.
Right.
That makes it very, very exciting for me. And I mean, like I said, we need Superman for me has always been that like it's not just the upstanding. It's not like, oh, he's untouchable and he's kind of looking down on us. It's like, no, he's one of us and he wants to be one of us and he wants us to be our better selves. And
that's right.
I think when you get that right and you get that combination of elements right and you show that to people, it's something, especially in this day and age, we could use a little bit more of. So
I agree.
Very excited to see how that
I mean,
goes.
that trailer was dripping with hope, right? It just felt hopeful. Everything was bright.
And that's what I think of with Superman. It's hope. Like you want to feel that. That's what that's what Mark Waid came up with. That stands for hope. So I agree 100%. You have to feel hope and joy and love when you come out of a Superman film. I think that's what the best Superman stories have done, including Superman Smashes the Klan. And I'm being completely sincere. I think this is one of the great Superman stories of all time. And so many people love this story. And I hope you feel that love. Like all of my friends, so many people recommend this comic. People who aren't Superman fans love this comic. And I've recommended it to so many people. So thank you so much to you and the rest of the team for doing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for hanging out. This has been amazing. Thank you, Gene, for celebrating Superman with me. I really appreciate it.